With global employee engagement at a historic low and leaders facing increasing pressure to perform in a turbulent climate, the way we manage change must change. What got us here today won't take us where we need to go tomorrow. According to Robert Quinn, author of the best-selling book Deep Change and my guest today, as fast, furious, and constant change takes root in our everyday work lives, putting pressure on organizations and individuals to adapt or perish, many of us are choosing a dangerous tactic, keeping our heads down and our mouths shut, a no passion, no risk, no commitment work ethic. Are we collectively taking the path to slow career death, or is there a better path to take? I will explore this question with Quinn, who is Professor Emeritus of Management and Organizations at the University of Michigan and co-founder of the Center for Positive Organizations. This is E3. Engage and empower with empathy. Welcome to the show, Bob. It is an incredible delight to have you here. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time now. Before we get into the details of your book, Deep Change, because that will really be the topic of today's dialogue, I'd love to just get your pulse on deep change today, because your book was written 30 years ago, basically. And I was still in school in the mid-90s, so I don't know what it was like to be in the workforce at that time. But I have a feeling your book was probably fairly provocative at the time. I consider you a pioneer in change management. I just wonder if you were to revise your book today to update it for today's circumstances, would you make any changes? Because I personally felt like it was incredibly relevant even today.
Maybe a little background on the story behind the book and then address your question. When I wrote that book, I felt it very, very deeply. I published the book and it sold very few copies. I was kind of shocked by that and went on to other projects. And at the end of the second year, my publisher called and she said, "You've outsold year number one." And I thought, big deal. And I was fairly unresponsive, I think. She called the third year and she said, "You've outsold year number two." And I again had the feeling, big deal. And I said, why are you calling me and telling me this? And she said, "You just don't get it." I said, "What is it I don't get?" She said, "This is a cult book." I said, "A cult book? What in the world is a cult book?" She said, "People in pain are reading this book and finding great value in it, and they're giving it to their friends or recommending it to the friends. It's a word of mouth book. It's on an exponential growth curve, and it's going to have big impact." Now, I had a very hard time believing that when she said it, but it turned out she was exactly right. It just kept climbing every year. The result has been that over the years, there have been an endless flow of letters and emails and various kinds of contacts where people say, "My business had collapsed. I was absolutely devastated. I couldn't function. I read the book. Everything changed." Or, "I was an addict. I was working in a company. I was getting worse and worse, and I was about to lose my job. I read the book." And the stories just go on and on and on of people who were really in crisis and didn't know what to do. But the book helped them make that change. Others have used it collectively to have groups, teams, organizations change. But it was very much a high impact book for people who were in need. Now, the need word is very interesting because when you and I are feeling comfortable, we have no desire to deal with the dynamics of transformation, because the dynamics of transformation are incredibly challenging. They require me to leave my comfort zone, to open up to new possibilities, and to think and feel in association with the processes of deep learning, which I usually want to avoid. People just don't know how to cope with those dynamics because they live in a conventional mindset. Everybody, you, me, everyone. And we want to be in that conventional mindset. When we face these major life challenges, they become windows to become who we really are. You were describing to me your current work, and you said I was interviewing for more corporate jobs and it didn't feel like me. I started doing this work and it really started to feel like me. Very, very few people in this world have the opportunity to go through a day where they feel like me, right? The real person, the authentic person, people doing what really matters to them. Well, that's what you're doing now. And that's what usually happens to people when they go through deep change processes. They find the authentic self. They begin to align with the authentic self. Their view of the world changes. Their capacity to bring change changes, and a new reality emerges.
What brought you to write this book to begin with? Because it sounds like, as your publisher said, it became a cult book. Was that the original intent, to help individuals who are suffering, or were you going into organizations, seeing clients struggling with guiding people through change in their organizations, and then you decided to write it? So what was the trigger?
All my life, it's been clear to me that the most significant contribution I can make is to help someone make a permanent change for the better. When that happens, my life becomes very, very meaningful. And that was clear to me at a very young age. I made the decision basically to major in change. There was no such major. I had to fight the university and the world to create a major in change. And then I went on in graduate school to study organization development because it was about change. In my professional life, I did research on change. I consulted on change. I taught classes on change. That one word was synergistic. It pulled every aspect of my life together. I was an applied behavioral scientist. I did science, but I was always applying science. The application caused me to learn things that shaped my science, and the findings in the science shaped my efforts. But all of that was always about helping people make significant changes in their lives. And that path is something I hold very precious. It's led me to a life that's been very abundant for me.
Talk about living your authentic self from a very young age. I mean, it sounds like you were really tuned into that authenticity from the very beginning, which is rare.
Yeah. I think that statement is true, but there's a caveat. Every one of us faces pressures all day long, every day, to leave the authentic self. I'm an old man, and yet on a daily basis, I default to ego, and I have to pay a lot of attention and work very hard to get out of ego, because that's the natural place to be. I don't think of authenticity as something I achieved at an early age. I think it's something I discovered, and my entire life has been a battle to spend more time in authenticity than I do out of it. But it's a battle, and it's not something you win and check off on a checklist. It's a fight we go through every single day. But when we have occasional victories and we make a positive difference, the payoffs are simply enormous. And life is very much worth living.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. And you're reminding me of some Buddhist principles of letting go of ego and really tuning into who you are at the core. It is a battle. We're being constantly challenged. You mentioned this concept in your book, and actually I'll put it up on the screen because this is a video podcast. Deep change. This was published 30 years ago, but it is so incredibly relevant today. It really is a book that just never ages. And I loved how you were talking about the concept of a myth. I read a lot of change management books, and yours is so unique because it just really covers concepts that you don't see in the typical change literature. So anyway, you talk about myth and you define it as a story that provides meaning and insight, and it helps us make sense of our world and our existence in it. And then you go on to say that a myth is about personal enlightenment and collective renewal. It's the hero's journey through individual transformation. So can you kind of talk about that concept a little bit more? And how can we tune into this concept of the myth as business leaders?
You ask wonderful questions because they are so rich. It would take a 3-hour response. So let me just take a shot at some of those things. First of all, today we live in absolute chaos. You only need to pick up your phone, look at the headlines. It's extreme, extreme chaos and volatility. We cannot predict tomorrow or the next day. Now, what that means is we are programmed biologically to seek equilibrium and to protect equilibrium. That's what the ego's all about, is how do I survive and how do I have an equilibrium that allows that to happen? There's always a bias towards what we already know. We worked hard to learn what we know. And when a signal comes to the autonomic nervous system saying there's a change out there, and the change is very threatening, we know a lot now about what happens to the body. The detection of threat, the emergence of stress. We may not be conscious of that. A couple of years ago, I went to the dentist with a cracked tooth, and he was fixing it. And he said, "You got several teeth that are on the verge of cracking." I said, "That can't be right." He said, "Yeah, it is." He says, "But don't feel lonely." I said, "Well, what do you mean don't feel lonely?" He said, "It's an epidemic." I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "We're overwhelmed with cracked teeth because people are so stressed out." I said, "I'm not stressed. I'm never stressed. I live in peace." He said, "You're full of stress." Well, that night I went home. I was watching the news on TV, and I stopped and paid attention to myself. My jaw was clenched. My body was tight. And suddenly I realized that in the last few years, my body was carrying deep stress. I wasn't particularly aware of it. I'm pretty good at managing it on a conscious level. Just the other night, I woke up at 3 a.m. asking myself if democracy was going to collapse in the next few weeks. I've never asked a question like that before. I'm perceiving threat, meaning uncertainty, and my body's responding. Well, think about the pandemic. Think about the teenagers who live on your street. I've had a lot of conversations with the mothers on my street, and we talk about what's happened to these kids. It turns out that our kids are carrying extraordinary stress that I didn't have to deal with. So it's everywhere. Now, when we talk about the myth and the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell was a brilliant, brilliant man who laid out the stages in transformational learning. And he talked about the myths that exist in every culture of the world. His model is on all the cubicles at Disney. When you watch The Lion King or you watch any Disney movie, any one of them, they are laid out on Campbell's hero's journey. The hero suddenly finds himself in a dark night of the soul. Uncertainty's high. Crisis is there. I don't know what to do. And then these stages unfold. So chaos is actually fairly predictable in terms of the change process. There's an enormous resistance to change, even by people who say, "Oh, I love change." They love change as long as it's incremental and they can control it. But the moment it's transformational and they can't control it and they have to walk by faith, that is, learn their way into a new reality, every human being backs away. Yet it's on that journey that some predictable things happen. When you reach the darkest moment, the only place you can go is to the center of your soul and ask, what do I really value? What is my real purpose in life? What is my real identity? What is my authentic self? Now, at that moment, everything else burns away, all the distractions. At that moment, you clarify your identity and your destiny. And at that moment, you experience rebirth. That term makes a lot of people uncomfortable because it has a lot of usage in religion. But in 1977, Abraham Lesnick wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review that became the most controversial article in the history of the review. It was called The Twice Born Leader. And what he argued was, until a manager has lived in personal crisis and been reborn. They can't lead. Now that generated hundreds of angry letters. Now, 50 years later, with the science of post-traumatic growth and many other subsets of science, we know that he was pretty much right. There's a rebirth process that comes with trauma, crisis, and so forth. And with that comes vision, understanding, learning, caring, empathy, tools we didn't necessarily have prior to that rebirth. And all of a sudden, we have the ability to do things we couldn't do before. And that often includes helping others get through life, or life punctuated by crisis. When that happens, you begin to understand crisis is a moment of great, great opportunity, because people are really hurting, people are really scared. And if you introduce appropriate principles, they can learn at a faster rate than they've ever learned before. I'll just give you an example. We do sessions every quarter for CEOs, presidents, and directors where we invite 8 people to come to an unusual setting, and we ask each one of the participants to address the question, what was the dark night of my soul and what did I learn from it? So we're inviting CEOs to come to a room full of strangers and talk about a topic that who in their right mind would talk about. Well, we've run 11 or 12 of these now. Our response rate to the invitations is 100%. We've never had anybody decline. They come and they tell stories that some of them have never told before. On the first day of the pandemic, my 300 retail outlets went to zero revenue. We didn't sell a single thing on that day. Now, if you have a big company and your revenue goes to zero in one day, you have a crisis unlike any crisis you've ever imagined. What do you do? And so they tell their stories. There's all kinds of circumstances, but the stories are strikingly similar. There was nothing for me to do. I had no idea what to do. So I gathered the people I trusted and said, here's our situation. And they didn't have ideas either. But we put out everything on the table. There was no posturing. There was no politics. There was just purpose and authenticity. And we said, we'll come back together tomorrow. And we came back the next day. And they began to share ideas. The ideas were crazy. But we took some of those. We tried them. Half of them failed, but some of them succeeded. The next day we did it again. Now here's the interesting thing. It's the end of the pandemic. In our company, we have 2 business models, 2 successful business models. One is the model we had before the pandemic, and one is the model we have now that came from the pandemic. We are so much stronger than we ever were before. Now, that story is very simple, but it carries incredible nuance, implications, points of learning, and all of them are outside of conventional management thinking, practice, theory, because all of management theory orbits around some very central assumptions. Man or woman is a self-interested, rational actor. Resources are scarce. Competition's natural. Hierarchies are necessary. People must be controlled. And every one of those assumptions is grounded in hundreds of thousands of studies. We know these assumptions hold. What we can't see is when they don't hold. And what we discover in positive organization scholarship, positive organization psychology, where we ask the question, what are individuals, organizations, and groups like at their best? We find an entirely different reality that violates conventional theory. And it's about contribution, ego transcendence, collaboration, trust, creation of new realities, working together in different ways, all the things that they did after the pandemic hit, which they never would have done prior to the pandemic. In other words, the crisis threw them into a set of behaviors that they were forced to engage in because there was no other choice. And in the process, they discovered things they could not conceive of previously. Now, some people go through that and they never think about it. It just ends. Other people go through it and say, this is extraordinary. Is it possible to have this without crisis? I call that the question that changes everything. If crisis can create social excellence without leadership, can leadership create social excellence without crisis? Now, the average executive cannot ask that question because they can't conceive of that question. But the executive who learns to ask that question now is looking down a new hallway of possibility. Can I learn to create social excellence in organizations by leading? Now, again, the majority of authority figures in this world, in the private sector, public sector, everywhere, are managers. They hold conventional theory, governed by ego, trying to preserve equilibrium. So their job is problem solving. The disruptions are coming to them too. And their job is to solve those problems, return to equilibrium. They're anchored in the past. They're anchored in fear. They're anchored in the past. And they're doing what everybody does. Leaders do not do away with the conventional mindset. It never goes away. Leaders transcend the conventional mindset. They have all the skills, ability, and knowledge that's embedded in the conventional mindset, and they have more. They operate from a different set of principles. Instead of problem solving, which they must do all day, every day, they do purpose finding. What is our highest purpose? What is our highest possibility? Now, when you know purpose and possibility, then how you solve problems changes. You solve problems to long-term vision, and the culture changes, and you perform at a higher level. That's what leaders do. That doesn't make any sense to the average authority figure who lives in the conventional mindset. So if you put all that together, if you go back to Selesnik and rebirth, the rebirth is discovering this additional possibility. It's transcending fear and creating excellence. The average person who hasn't gone through those changes is oblivious to it, and if they're exposed to it, they're terrified. They run from it, right? And so if you go back to Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, here's this myth, this story. It exists in every culture. How can that be possible? Well, because it occurs in every culture all the time. Now, it's always 1 in 1,000. We focus on 999. We don't focus on 1. But all around us, there are incredibly healthy, positive people leading other people to better places. But it's 1 in 1,000. And we're not trained to look at that, to see it, to understand it, and to learn how to do it. But Joseph Campbell looked across all those cultures and he found those themes, right? He created that model. Disney reproduces it every time they make a movie.
Well, this is incredible. Like, I have so many questions now. But I mean, just hearing you talk through this, it reminds me so much of the conversation I had recently with Barry Waymiller CEO Bob Chapman, who I'm sure you're familiar with. Another wonderful Bob. I actually asked him in our interview, I said, when can we stop waiting for a crisis or a tragedy to take care of our people at work? And his response was, yes, we're all reacting to things. And we were talking about safety in the workplace, how someone has to get injured or, God forbid, die for leaders to step up and go, oh shoot, well this can't be happening. But then they always go to, oh, our workers' compensation is going up. They always go back to the metrics, right? The typical business metrics that you're taught to measure in business school. And he emphasized, he said, we're not doing this to be more productive. We're not doing this to make a profit. We're doing it because it is the right thing to do, to send our employees home safe to their families. And so his purpose and his vision has always been his people And he'll go into an interview with media and spend the whole time talking about his people and not his products. And then the interviewer will be like, Bob, what you spent the entire hour not even mentioning what Barry Waymiller does. And he was like, my product is my people. And I think that's incredibly unique, and he's always stood out in that space. But to me, it's common sense. Why are we waiting for a tragedy? Why are we waiting for a pandemic to be more visionary, to be more purpose driven? So I guess my question for you, and I know we're going a little off script, but I can't help but ask, how are we coaching leaders who have not gone through that rebirth? How are they able to carry their people through transformation or change if they haven't experienced that themselves? Is it a teachable skill?
Bob Chapman is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Bob Chapman, if you take 1,000 CEOs, Bob Chapman is 1 in 1,000, right? He's not like the other people because he has taken that additional step and he sees realities that they don't see. It just doesn't make sense to talk for an hour about your people and say they are your product. That's wrong. We all know that's wrong. So, this guy Chapman, what's wrong with him? He's marching to a different drum. When you decided to not go for that corporate job and dedicate yourself to your current mission, you were marching to a different drum. That's not what you were supposed to do. You were stepping outside the normal curve. You were moving to the far right edge of that normal curve. Now that's where excellence lives, at the far right side of the normal curve. Excellence is, by definition, positive deviance. It's deviance from the norm. Now, Bob Chapman has had experiences in his life that have caused him to see things other people can't see. That's what Zeleznik was talking about in terms, it usually comes by crisis. Occasionally, very rarely, it comes by purpose. Those are the two paths: crisis that forces you to learn, or purpose. If you have a purpose that's bigger than you are, you begin to do what's right, even though that throws you into uncertainty and possible punishment. So now you're learning things other people aren't learning because they refuse to go to that space. Everybody's trying to minimize risk. They're operating from ego. I want to minimize my risk. Today, in the political world, we're watching vast numbers of people not respond to things they normally would go to war over because they're fearful of the risk that's present. That was never there before. We see it everywhere. We're talking about very general truths here. How do you help people? One thing to keep in mind is another curve called the change readiness curve. Whenever you walk into a room, let's say with 100 people, there are 3 or 4 people in that room who are right now on the very cliff, the very edge of making changes in a given aspect of their life. All you have to do is take a hand and wave it, and they're starting to change. Next to them are some people who have been concerned about things. They've been thinking about change for a long time. They're not ready to jump off the cliff, but they're pretty close to the cliff. Now, if you follow that line, it goes all the way back to people who are in a situation, have never given a single thought to changing in a given area. And if you surface the possibility, they become deeply resistant. Now, here we are talking about engaging the workforce, building trust, taking care of our people are our product. There are vast numbers of intelligent, highly educated, highly experienced professionals who are absolutely offended by the ridiculousness of that notion. They are not ready to listen to your podcast, and they're not going to listen, right? On the other hand, if we go to the other end of the curve, there are people who are ready. And when you talk to them or do broadcast your podcast, they are moved. And tonight at dinner, they have a new conversation. And tomorrow, they're doing something they've never done before. And then there's another group right next to them that are a lot closer to jumping than they were yesterday. So people are at different levels of change readiness. And the coach, the teacher, the speaker, the executive, the leader are at different levels of effectiveness. Some influencers can at best just reach those 3 or 4 people who are ready to jump. Some influencers are more skilled. They can reach the next group. They can even reach the next group. And in the most extreme resistant group, those people go to bed with new ideas in their head that can germinate over the next period of time. So there are different levels of change mastery. Some people are novices. Most people are experts. A handful of people are masters. Bob Chapman is a master. He's not an expert, he's a master. The difference between an expert and a master is that experts have conditional confidence. If you give them a problem where the parameters are exactly the same as the last time they solved it, they feel very confident. If you give them a problem that's outside those parameters, they become very, very fearful and they don't function very well. If you give a master a problem outside the parameters, he or she does not become fearful because they know how to learn in the midst of uncertainty, and they know how to bring people through the process of learning in uncertainty. And so they don't need fixed problems. And those people are very different. And when you run into them, you usually cherish them the rest of your life because they've made such a positive impact in your life. But most of the people you encounter are not masters of positive influence.
So it's a matter of really finding the masters or even the experts when you're leading through change, trying to find those particular influencers in the organization who can help kind of, like the domino effect, really. So it's not one person can drive change.
You can find them. They're actually easy to find. Most people aren't looking for them. Kim Cameron and I have traveled the planet for the last 20 years talking about the science of positive leadership, positive change. And one of the principles that we teach is with a lot of scientific background. If you want to change your organization, begin with the positive energizers. There are people distributed across your organization who carry positive energy. They may be secretaries, they may be senior executives, but they're different than the others. People are attracted to them because people are hungry for positive energy. If you bring together the positive energizers and let them lead the process, they also tend to be very influential. They also tend to listen. They do all the things that your podcast is about. If you assemble that group of people and make them your change team, amazing things happen. I'm not just making this up. This is something that we've worked with companies on for 20 years. And I could tell you story after story after story of bringing those positive energizers together, having them lead the process of learning in the face of uncertainty, and then naturally bringing others into the process. It's not a control model, it's an infection model. You're infecting the system with positive change. The hierarchical mindset will not stand for a model of positive infection. It cannot process the model.
From rebirth and transformation to the hero's journey and engaging positive influencers during change, we covered a lot of fascinating topics in this episode. I was so connected to Bob's message, I felt I could talk to him for hours. And that's basically what we did. Our conversation continued longer than my usual podcast episodes, so you will have the special treat of hearing from Bob again next week. If you thought this conversation was eye-opening, you're in for a real treat next week, where Bob talks about intention and purpose and even catches me off guard by asking me about my own journey. So stay tuned, and thanks for being here. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. And if you would like to learn more about the Empathy Collective, check out our website, theempathycollective.com. Life is too short. Let's take care of each other at work so that together we can make this world a better place.